Welcome to the Leader's Agenda, a series dedicated to reimagining leadership within life sciences. My name is Tarja Huuskonen, and I'm your host. The Leader's Agenda invites insights and perspectives from some of the very best leaders of our time. Wisdom that you too can build into your own leader's agenda. So with me today is Kristophe Diaz. He is the Executive Director and Chief Scientific Officer of Cure PSP. Cure PSP is a non-profit advocacy organization focused on primorph live neurodegenerative disorders in the rare disease space. So we're going to have a very interesting conversation about rare disease in general in the healthcare system, as well as how does a non-profit organization like Cure PSP tie into our innovation model within life sciences. Welcome, Kristophe.
And good to be here, Tarja.
Wonderful to see you. You are joining today from New York City.
That's correct. Yep.
So that is also where Cure PSP is headquartered, I assume.
Yeah, we have our offices here, and because of the pandemic now, we have a lot of employees in different states, but a few of ours are there in New York City.
Yeah. So I just said we're going to be focusing on rare disease. So I'm going to have to really start with a very basic question. First of all, what is a rare disease and why should we be focusing on rare disease in context of just sort of the whole healthcare system? How important is this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And the definition of rare disease really depends on different regulatory agencies. In the US, is that any diseases that has less than 200,000 people with the disease is considered a rare disease. In Europe, the number is a bit lower. And I think, it matters for a different point of view, but the definition of rare disease also has been used in regulatory agencies to change the regulatory process. So if someone, let's say, develop a new solution or treatment for a rare disease, the path that one has to take to go through the regulatory process will be different, in a way, accelerated compared to more common diseases. Another thing to keep in mind is a number I always like to share with people. There's around 7,000 biologically defined or clinically defined rare diseases that exist. And if you look at the incidence or the number of people that have those rare diseases, it's around 1 in 10 people in the United States have a rare disease. So even though there are 7,000 distinct rare diseases that are really hard to diagnose, if you pull them all together, that's almost 10% of the population that is suffering a rare disorder.
That's a remarkable number, 1 in 10. So yeah. I oftentimes when I listen, when you think about the word rare disease, then you wonder how many of us actually come in touch with rare disease, either within our own personal life as a patient or within our families. 1 in 10. That's a United States number, I assume.
Yeah.
Right. So 1 in 10. That would basically say that many of us are very likely at some point within our lifetime be affected by a rare disease within our family.
Or know someone.
Yeah, or know someone.
Absolutely. And if you think, so it's around, I forgot now the population in the US is like 350 million. So that's around 35 million people that are suffering a rare disease. But again, 7,000 categories of them. So that's what makes it a rare disease and complicated to manage, because they are rare. And so they're hard to even diagnose or even to know that a particular person has it.
So what is the healthcare system doing about rare disease in context of, if we think about the whole spectrum of activities that happen in healthcare innovation and in innovation of care? Where does rare disease fall?
I guess my short answer is that not much, right? It's in the US is well known that the healthcare system is managed mostly as a business. And so when a company decides to go towards a new indication, let's say, if a big pharma builds, let's say, a neuroscience department, they will just look at a business case, which has a lot of advantages. It has driven innovation in the US more so than other countries. But if you think of a rare disease and you have let's say, a population of 20,000 people, which is the case with PSP that have the disease at any given moment, if you do just a number, if you just treat it as a business, then there's no reason to go after it. And so most big companies are reluctant to go after it because it doesn't make a business sense. And so that's the main issue, because you have 7,000 different categories of people that are under such a rare disease umbrella, and it's just hard to attract real dollars and real momentum to those diseases, just from that kind of core point of view of the healthcare system.
So I want to come back to that conversation a little bit more about what that means for us and what we need to do differently from an innovation perspective. But before we do that, so your organization, the name is Cure PSP. For those of us who don't necessarily know the acronyms that well, can you help translate, first of all, PSP, and that is one of those rare diseases. And is that the only focus of your organization, or is the focus broader?
So we focus on 3 diseases. The PSP stands for progressive supranuclear palsy. So it's complex clinical name there that describe a little bit of the mechanism of the disease. We have another disease in our portfolio, so we really support 3 different type of patients and their family that are going through those diseases. PSP1, the second one is CBD, cortical basal degeneration. From a biological point of view, it's similar to PSP. It's even more rare than PSP, and it's even harder to diagnose than PSP just because of the clinical presentation. And the third disease is multiple system atrophy, MSA. It's a disease that has some biology in common with Parkinson. PSP and CBD have some common biology with Alzheimer. MSA is also a rare disease. The 3 of them affect some basic biological function. If you think of Alzheimer affecting cognition, personality, mood, memory, etc., PSP and CBD affect part of the brain that are dealing with more basic function like posture, gait, speech, swallowing, particular eye movement, and things like that. So the symptoms are a bit more subtle at first, and they are motor. MSA affects the so-called autonomic systems, so the system that regulates your blood pressure and things that you don't have to think, right, to regulate. It's a basic system. So people that have MSA, for instance, when they get up, would have huge drop in blood pressure, and many other things can lead to that, right? So this is why it's also very difficult to diagnose. And the last point on those is that the first symptoms are observed a little sooner than other neurodegenerative disorders. Parkinson can happen quite soon, but Alzheimer, for instance, an age-related disorder. So those 3 diseases can happen as early as 50 years old. And so when people start to show those symptoms, doctors in general don't think of neurodegeneration because around 50-year-old, you don't show evidence. There's not a large percentage of the population in that age group that has neurodegeneration. So it's even harder to diagnose because a doctor will think of something else. Maybe we'll think of a stroke or lifestyle issue or cardiovascular disease. Will not think that maybe the brain is starting to lose brain cells. And maybe I should define what neurodegeneration is.
So is misdiagnosis a common phenomena for patients with these conditions?
If I had the one magic wand and if I could change something and I could not just cure the disease, right, because that would be too powerful of a magic wand, the one thing I would try to change is increasing the efficiency of diagnosis. It's really, really difficult to diagnose. I think now it takes between 3 to 4 years from the time that a patient decides that they have to go to the doctor, and sometime, it could take years for someone noticing something wrong with them to then deciding to talk to a doctor. And once they talk to a doctor, your generalist or the general neurologist, it takes up to 3 years for people to start to think that it might be PSP. And the tragic part of this is the reason that eventually they identify PSP or CBD or MSA is because the symptoms have progressed quite severely. That those diseases, progressive supranuclear palsy, the word progressive means that it progresses, and it progresses quite quickly. So within 2 to 3 years, people have a combination of symptoms that if you then go on your manual of medicine, you have a higher chance to say, oh, maybe it's PSP, because you start to have so many overlapping issues. So it's not just that doctors eventually have this light bulb that says PSP. It's because the disease advances to such a point that by elimination, it can only be that. And so it's very difficult for patients because they have mostly unknowns in front of them for many, many years. So they cannot really prepare for their care, or they cannot even try to do some of the treatments that are effective in increasing quality of life for those really difficult diseases.
So I know that there's a lot that we are yet to learn in the neurodegenerative space and in the space of brain in general, but we're also making a lot of progress. Is it, and you said, okay, the magic one that you would love to have is the one for diagnosis, and I love that idea of being able to diagnose something earlier. The question I have for you is, what are we, are there already, is there technology, for instance, is there science that makes diagnosis easier? And how much of this is, for instance, genetic, where that diagnosis could be tied to genomics, biomarkers, whatever types of ways by which we would actually predict things a bit earlier. Is that possible in this space?
So one more aspect of technology and how technology has advanced progress in neurodegeneration, especially in diagnosis, is being able to really understand the genetics, right? Because it's not just about finding a mutation that is associated with a disease, like the smoking guns, low-hanging fruit,
Right.
They don't exist for many neurodegenerative disorder, but it's about finding risk alleles or particular version of your DNA that gives you a higher likelihood to be at risk of developing neurodegenerative disease. And being at risk, it means that if you have other issues, cardiovascular issues or exposure to environment, then this risk factor increases likelihood that you will develop neurodegeneration. So that has been a really exciting advance. That is, that the main consequence or the main reason of this advance is technology development for genomics.
So let's go back then to your organization in context of this innovation process, because innovation takes many parties for that to really kind of come in here. Now, CurePSP actually has a lofty vision, as I read in your website. It says it is about how to actually have a world free of neurodegenerative disease. And specifically in the rare disease space. So based on what you just said, and you said, okay, your magic one first would go into the diagnostic space and maybe not quite to we've cured forever. So my assumption here then is that what we're really looking at this very moment would be to not just understand this space better, but find the diagnostic tools, for instance, as well as some treatments. But how far are we from actual cure? Do you see that possible in a future that's realistic for us to imagine?
I guess it depends. I present to a lot of patients and families once or twice a month. I talk to people that are with the disease, and that's the one question they ask me all the time.
Yeah.
When they're diagnosed with the disease, they have 4 to 6 years left, and they we help them through the journey, and they ask me, when are we going to get it to a cure? And this is the most difficult question, right? Because as you said, the brain is the least understood organ in the entire body. Why are cells starting to degrade, or why are those proteins accumulating? The questions are still unanswered. So there are three steps to developing a therapy. There's preventing the disease from progressing, so then stopping the disease. Then there is preventing the disease from happening, right? And that's really the holy grail. If we can do the first part, if we can prevent cells from dying, then there's also the question, like, can we do something to regenerate those cells that have been lost? And that's also the most complicated thing to do, right? So if you think of regenerative medicine. So I'm really focusing on slowing down disease progression. And, another question, I'm bringing all the problems, not the solutions here, is like, you want to slow it down at the right time for a patient, right? So this is why you want to diagnose it as quickly as possible, because then if there is a treatment that even slows down the disease by a few percent, and families think that it's valuable enough for them, they want to be able to have access to those therapies early on. Right. And I'll mention recently this company has developed a treatment for ALS. It just got approved by the FDA a few weeks ago. that increases lifespan of patients by 25%. And they die between 2 and 4 years. So it's not a lot of time, but at least it's on the market, at least families, it's an oral drug, so the burden of administration is not too high compared to an injection into your cerebral spinal fluid, which a lot of other companies are developing therapeutics for that. So we have something that can help ALS patients. It's the first time ever. It's not a blockbuster, it's not revolutionary, but it's revolutionary in a way that it gives a little bit more hope and more time to patients. And we hope that we will see this for PSP, I would say between 5 to 10 years, and I really hope it's under 5, and I'm working actively with a few groups that are aiming towards the same strategy to try to slow it down. But again, you want to slow it down when the quality of life is it's something that the family are happy with. The disease progresses really quickly, people become incapacitated and handicapped. You don't want to slow it down too late, so it's a big ethical point of view and a complex conversation to have with all the different stakeholders. The FDA is really interested in that and understanding what is good quality of life versus a quality of life that we should not maintain for a patient. And the studies are just starting to happen now. So anyway, a lot of things to discuss.
So I have to ask a very basic question about Cure PSP. What exactly does your organization do?
Yeah.
What's the day-to-day work?
I'll start. You start with the vision, right? Visions have to be almost impossible to attain, but it's something to thrive towards, right? But our mission is to raise awareness, build community, improve care, and find a cure for PSP, CBD, and MSA. And that really defines our day to day. And we rewrote the mission after I joined. I wanted to have something that it's simple, speaks to everyone. So we want to raise awareness for this disease. One path towards accelerating a time to diagnosis is to have more people aware of it. So if you're the friend of your neighbor has it and you know about it, you might say to them, hey, maybe you have this disease that you should go talk to a specialized neurologist or contact Cure PSP. Build community, it's a broad term that we choose on purpose. It really is a community of patients and family. What we get quite a few phone calls a day of people that just got diagnosed. So we have 2 employees on staff that this is their job to just guide the patients, from this cliff that they reached, and then we kind of walk them away from it, and then we help them find support. We have support groups all across the country that are led by volunteers, right? So we have a staff of 12, just hired someone 2 weeks ago. So we were 11 2 weeks ago, now we're 12. And so it's not a lot of people, but we have a lot of peer supporters that have lost someone to the disease and they want to stay connected and help the community. So we have all the support groups that meet on a regular basis, some just for men, some for second generation children or grandchildren of people having either of the 3 diseases. We have support groups that are specific to all the diseases. We have support groups that are called PSP 101. So it's a way to say, if you never heard about this and you've been diagnosed with this, you will meet other people that are at the same stage as you are, so they can help each other. And then we have them regional. So then if you have improved care, that's, finding a cure, it's long term. Like, what can we do now, right? What can we do for patient now, tomorrow, next year? So we have a network of Cure PSP centers of care, which are, self-standing, best-in-class medical center throughout the country. We have 2 in Canada and 28 in the United States. They're already providing amazing care to PSP patients and other diseases. We just have a recognition of a Cure PSP center of care, so we increase the likelihood that a patient that goes on our website will find this medical center. They are, world-known neurologists are already treating the disease. We help them develop their own support group if they don't have any. We have a grant to try to foster collaboration between those different centers. As those centers are kind of living in their own silos. They're really busy getting their grants and doing their work. If you think of MGH in Massachusetts or Hopkins, those are 2 centers of care. So we have a grant out there so they can propose particular project that has to do with access to care, equality to access to care, and also questions of, let's say, end of life, or how do you talk to a patient in the telemedicine fashion? I told you that the disease progresses fast. Once it's really advanced, it can no longer go see a doctor. So what do you do with them? Neurologists sometimes see the patient no longer showing up to the visit. So can we put in place systems that we can remotely assess patients? So that's the care. at the last point of the mission to find a cure, we already talked about this, we fund early scientists that are maybe finishing their postdoc or PhD. They're somehow got connected to PSP biology. If we don't exist, they go to the NIH or they go to bigger foundation, and those foundations are primarily funding, Alzheimer, Parkinson, and large type of disease research, just because this is where most of the investment is also needed. So we fund seed grants, so they stay within the space and they can build some results and some data that eventually allow them to go for much bigger funding sources from the NIH. And then we also fund grants that have to do with biomarker development and things that are closer to bringing a cure. We don't have a huge budget, but everything we do is funded by patients and their families. So we are almost 100% grassroots supported. This is something I want to mention too, because we don't have 2 or 3 philanthropists supporting us. We're getting thousands and thousands of donations from those that are going through those journeys. And then we reinvest that in those 3 pillars that I call care, consciousness, and cure. Those are the 3 buckets that really explain the mission. So yeah, that's what we do on a day-to-day. And we do that thanks to all the community work. It really encompasses all the doctors, the researchers, the patients, the people that have lost a loved one that want to stay involved in the advocacy. So we just organize this army of volunteers to go towards, the same goal.
Now, your own background, you are a cell and molecular biologist, I think, by your education.
Yeah.
How important is that background in being able to lead an organization like yours?
Yeah, I do get that question often. If you see an executive director, often in nonprofit, they come from the business world. They have an MBA or something like that, and then and a scientist usually, just takes care of a portfolio. We're small and we have to do it all, right? I mean, PSP, CBD, and MSA, we don't have a lot of different sister organizations. There's one in England, there's one in Germany, there's a small one, so there's not that many people, so we have to do it all. And so because of that, and this is why I'm in a perfect position for what I like. It's science, but it's science applied to a real need right now. So to be a scientist is important because I am leading our scientific portfolio. I'm hiring another scientist on staff, and hopefully we'll have that within 3 months. But when a patient asks me a question, I don't talk to them assuming that they will not understand science. So I do the best I can to take complex ideas and then explain them to them in a way that they can understand. And that's really critical. And I think we don't do that enough. We tend to dumb everything down. And so then they're not aware of the challenges. They're not aware of why it's complicated. And I always try to tell them why it's complicated, why it takes 20 years for something to go from, someone's lab to someone's pharmacy, right? And so having the scientific background makes me, I can understand the core. The second point is that most of the solution now, and this is getting back on my soapbox, diseases should be defined scientifically, not clinically. I might get in trouble saying that. It's like a lot of diseases, a clinician who say, oh, you have this tremor, your eyes are no longer being able to go up and down, so maybe it's PSP. But eventually we need to get to a point where the disease is defined scientifically, so it will be more accurate. This is another wishful thinking, because we don't have those measures we talked about, blood test or wearable or eye tracking or something that objectively says, based on the science, you have X, Y, or Z. We still rely on clinicians and doing great work. But so science is leading the way, and then I'm a scientist, so I think I'm better equipped to understand which innovation might be beneficial to the problem we're trying to solve.
So Kristophe, based on what you just said, diseases need to be defined scientifically. Okay,
Yeah.
So who needs to do that? Is that the work of the life sciences companies? Is that is that a new paradigm that we need to also bring into education for doctors, for physicians? Who does that? If you get your wish on this one.
Yeah, well, if you look at big, I was going to say shops, but if you look at Novartis or Roche,
Right.
They have their basic science discovery engines, right? They have, I don't know, I was going to say hundreds, I don't know that, but maybe of scientists that really are trying to understand the core mechanisms of disease. But this is rare, right? So those are really just the top industry. Then you have CROs that are doing that for a contract for a very specific reason. So now you're too advanced already. You're advanced on trying to demonstrate a particular mode of action to see if it's druggable, for instance. So it's not basic science. But you do have companies that are excited by new discoveries. So again, neuroinflammation, it's a big topic, right? So instead of thinking of the protein that is involved in Alzheimer or Parkinson or PSP, maybe in the brain, as we age, proteins start to aggregate, proteins start to have issues because the quality control system of the brain start to fault because of age. But if you have, let's say, the same way when you're allergic to something, you have this exaggerated reaction that becomes potentially a disease. Maybe there is an inflammatory response when those type of proteins are starting to break down. And if we could address the inflammatory response, we could develop new therapeutics. So the reason I'm saying that is that you could see science leading new industry in being excited to address a new mechanisms to solve the same disease. So neuroinflammation, there are many companies now that are going after that specifically, and big pharma companies are developing entire department to address neuroinflammation. So I think science is starting to lead the way a bit more than just clinical description of a disease. That being said, civilians like us, you go to a doctor. When you want to have a diagnosis, you don't go to Novartis and you don't say, here,
Right.
take my blood
Correct.
and analyze me. I mean, a few maybe billionaires do that, but most people don't. And so then how do you bring this back to doctors? This is the main issue. It's the gap between innovation and public knowledge,
Yeah.
right? It takes way too many years for those two dots to be connected. And so,
yeah. So really, we talk about patient education. We have to really talk about physician education in a very different way if we're going to change that.
And I think, absolutely, because when new diagnostic system come in play, it's really difficult to get to a point where a doctor will realize that those methods now exist and what do they do, right? Because they're really core scientific tests, right? So there's a skin biopsy now for Parkinson that you can look at a particular protein that aggregates in the brain, and people have developed a correlate with a skin biopsy. So I'm assuming it took a lot of work to get most doctors, and they all understand the notion of a skin biopsy, but the correlation between detecting something in the skin that is correlated to a central nervous system disease, they all get it, but I'm sure it took a huge effort to bridge those gaps. And I mean, probably a decade of marketing and outreach and education at conferences to get them all to say, hey, I should prescribe this test now that it's available. So how to accelerate that? That's outside of my pay grade.
And of course, the other thing from a patient perspective then is actually access to care from the perspective of economics, right? And you did say something about, well, if you're a billionaire, you might have access to all kinds of resources. Most of us are not billionaires. And so in this particular space, where are we as it relates to health equity and access to care?
Yeah, it's a big, in rare disease, it's even a bigger challenge than in more common diseases, just because the knowledge of doctors, right? So if someone has more resources, right, they will be in general, more organized, or they'll have, different doctors and different people they can talk to. And so they will probably, I don't have the statistics on that, but if I look at our population, it's there is a lot of people that have more resources that are really aggressively trying to go after what is it that they have. For instance, physical therapy is shown to be really good for preventing certain complicated symptoms of PSP. And so if you do regular physical therapy, daily basis, really targeted type of training, you can actually slow down certain symptoms. And to have this entire resource system at your availability, you have to be a little bit more well off, and you have to be a little bit more resourceful. So if you are having two jobs and then you're already struggling in daily life, and if PSP hits you, probably the path is much harder, but we don't know that yet. And so one of the things, just to actually, this makes me think of one of our models, is like I've identified that as a gap of really understanding the patient journey in a formal way, right? The same way a pharmaceutical company, before going to market, they want to understand the entire patient journey. So those are all the points of intervention to where to sell the product, right? we're not there yet, but I just found a couple family when I told them about the need of a patient journey. They decided to give money to Cure PSP to fund a project, and I found a professional that does patient journey for a living, and now we're doing one for PSP. So once we have that, we have an opportunity to make sure that the population that we include in all the interviews is representative of the US and not of a subsection of the US. So I'm not saying I have a solution, but we're working towards increasing the knowledge of what it means to have PSP in different socioeconomical backgrounds. So we'll see, but it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge.
It's a huge challenge. Now, on the research side, I think since we already talked about the fact that we don't know yet enough about some of these things, I was just recently in a genomics conference, and we had the conversation around what's the challenge on research and what's the challenge on being able to really take this to the next level. One of those challenges is actually that we don't have enough diversity in the base that we are researching. I think you and I had a conversation even about this a few months ago. There is a brain bank, for instance, that is used quite often for research purposes. And you had some interesting figures about that one in terms of what it represents. Can you remind me of that?
Yeah, so the majority of the brain, it's more than 90% of the brain that are in this brain bank are from white Caucasian individuals. And this is not a new problem. It's just that now that we're just starting to address it now. Yeah. You have some interesting study that UCSF is leading to do a lot of study in Latin America, but it's fairly recent. Of course, the interest always was there from scientists, but the actual actionable, progress that you can actually see biosamples from representative population, it's only very recent that there's a focus on that. For brain banking is even more difficult, I think, because of the bias that have existed, we've developed method to raise awareness about brain donation and reach out to family about brain donation of a very specific cultural background. I don't think we as the different researcher have the tools to be able to talk about brain donation in all different cultural backgrounds. Like we haven't done the work and the effort to really think about how do we do that respectfully, how do we listen to the community, to eventually find a method to let them know about why are those resources important. So it's really been a network of who knows who, and this brain bank that you're mentioning at the Mayo Clinic, it's a brain bank that Cure PSP has worked with for many years, more than 20 years, and it started as two doctors from the Einstein Institute there in the Bronx and Rutgers University that started to say, hey, we need to put those brains of those patients that we work with somewhere so we can study it. So it was organic. It was not supported financially at the level that a for-profit group would be supported. So, it grew organically with all the bias that you can think about. So it's a great resource, but it's limited because the biology, if you think of, at least it's gender balanced in this brain bank, more or less, but there's many differences in the biology of different cultural groups, genetic background, and predisposition to different comorbidity. If you think of the effect of cardiovascular health on brain health, right? Different countries are affected differently. So we don't have the data yet. There's big groups, that are trying now to go after this, that to really understand, are they biosamples around the world that are already available, they're already in some people's freezer, different labs in India or in Asia that we could go after and we could start to sequence and we could start to analyze to now quickly get to a more heterogeneous data set, but it's still fairly homogeneous, unfortunately.
So from a pure research perspective for a second here, what are the one to three most important questions to answer in the space of neurodegenerative rare disease?
I mean, I have two hats, right? I have the hat of the scientist who wants to understand the complexity of the central nervous system, and then their hat of, like, how do we get to a cure and to a treatment faster for patients, right? So if I put the first hat is, nobody knows why eventually those proteins. So there are many proteins that start to aggregate in Huntington, in Parkinson, in Alzheimer, in PSP. So there's a common mechanism. At one point, this protein start to aggregate, forms clumps inside cells and start to kill the cells. like the true. And so there's the first, and then the second one is that then this protein starts to spread from neurons to neurons, and it seems to propagate in the brain, and eventually kill enough brain cells that you see a symptom. The one thing is that you could have that for 10, 15, 20 years and have no symptoms because the brain is really resilient. And eventually, once you have symptoms, it's too late because the disease biologically has advanced too much. So scientifically, is really understanding why are those proteins starting to aggregate in such a way. So not just in a healthy aging way, we all have those protein aggregates. If you were to take the brain of anybody above 75 and then you look at those proteins, you would find lesions, but they're not pathological. In certain people, they seem to be, the cells are less resilient to this type of issues that are age-related and start to accelerate. So why protein aggregate will be one, how they spread will be another. For my other hat, it would be a biomarker type of play. It's like, how quickly could we get to an objective test? So if I were to think of a research question, would be, let's take the blood of a lot of PSP patients and let's throw hundreds of millions of dollars in analytics there to try to find a signature that is unique to PSP and that is longitudinal, that you can actually titrate the severity of the disease. Because if you had that, then a lot of company would use it to test a lot of interesting potential drug that they have in their freezer.
Kristophe, is that an invitation, and who would you address that invitation to? You just said let's,
it is. I mean,
who do we address it to?
I'll tell you, right? So PSP is often misdiagnosed as Parkinson.
Yes.
Right. So some anecdotal survey we did, around 50% of people we surveyed, they were given a Parkinson diagnosis first. And then eventually, as the disease progressed, they're diagnosed as atypical Parkinsonism. And then eventually, they're given a name, PSP. The reason I'm saying this to you is, like, if you go to Michael J. Fox Foundation, right, who has around $400 million to invest in research and is focusing primarily on Parkinson. And they have studies like PPMI is a longitudinal study where they acquire a lot of different measures of people with Parkinson over time: blood, MRI, gait, clinical scale evaluation. How do we collaborate with them, right? Because I'm certain that they have a certain percentage of false positive that they think it's Parkinson and eventually they're PSP. And I'm not saying they're not willing to do that, right? But it costs tens and tens of millions of dollars to create those cohort of patients that have Parkinson to be studied over a decade. So how do we just come in there and say, you probably have PSP data here, like, how do we collaborate? So when I say let's, I think there are some seeds of projects that already exist that probably have PSP data. And it's my role to go, knock at their door and try to develop a relationship and a partnership. And I'm doing that, right? So when you say let's, the second point is, it's really when pharma companies are excited by the new technology that we talked about, platforms that can detect analytes in the blood at a very low level, is how do we convince them to, when they test something on, let's say, 800 Parkinson patients, how do we convince them to add samples from 50 PSP patients to the millions of dollars that are already invested in those kind of basic science study, right? And I don't have an answer for that, but this is a dream of mine to say, we could fund, we could bring patient, we could help you also include PSP to progress that is already valuable to similar diseases.
Yeah. Well, this is such an important conversation, isn't it? Because we're talking about rare disease. Rare disease does not necessarily get funding in the same way at all as it's not going to be the big blockbuster. So who's going to bring the funding easily to that? Less so given the model that we live in. So now there's an organization like yours that it's on one hand is extremely, is with the patient. You're not just patient-centric. Yeah. You are with the patient every day. And so you have a wealth of information that could probably be used for a good advantage by some of these other organizations that are really seeking to make a difference in terms of therapies. And you are an integrator. I know you enough personally that I know that you are much of an integrator as a person. That's how I would describe you, what I've seen you in your career. You are a networker, you are not shy, you will knock on the doors, you will introduce yourself, and you'll not just introduce yourself, but you will introduce different organizations to one another. And it does seem like we need that. Is that the role of a not-for-profit in this kind of space, or do we need something beyond that?
Tough question. I think for the first part, I see this as my role, right? So, because to your point, we have interaction with patients every day, and as I mentioned, we would not exist without patients.
Yes.
Like financially, we are supported by patients primarily. And again, I keep on mentioning that thousands of donations. We get between 10,000 and 12,000 donations a year just by patient. So we have patient trust and the patient voice knocking at our door. We do have pharma companies, small biotechs that are either thinking of evaluating if a project in these diseases, or they're gearing towards, and they don't know where to find patients. I mean, of course they would, because they go to hospital, but they need to work with the patient advocacy foundation in order to outreach to patients. So I am at this juncture, right? So when I get connected to the stakeholder of a company that is the patient advocacy liaison, I always try to swim up that little stream and try to get back to the scientist or the decision maker that are more like of the science lead, to see how can we integrate PSP to other of their strategy there. And it's obviously not easy, and we are a small organization. Our clout is not huge, but we have the voice of patient. The second question, as you asked it kind of generated this, collaborating. This is a tough challenge that I want to discuss a little bit, is that we are competing. We're proud to be supported by patients, but we're also competing for those donations. And it's not a business approach of competition, but the reason I'm mentioning that is that it would be interesting if organizations that have a common goal around rare neurodegenerative diseases to collaborate together a little bit more strategically, a little bit more tangibly. And this is a complicated topic. I think we're all in our silos. We all in for our patient population, and it's a lot of work, and then we're all of us a little bit understaffed. But at the same time, it's difficult to find a real easy way to say, let's all collaborate. Let's all put $1 million into this, and now we have 5. Let's go after something bigger. And I kind of didn't think about this in such a clear way until this discussion. I mean, I know it's an issue because we're all in trying to do our work, but if we could collaborate a little bit more. Instead, what's happening is that you have groups like the Michael J. Fox Foundation that really became big, and they do amazing work, and they're willing to collaborate, but they also have their really complicated agenda. I have to mention it. I love one of my favorite tagline is that we are here until Parkinson isn't, right? And so and they're really doing a lot of that. So how to collaborate, and then you have other organizations like NORD, which really focus on all rare diseases. So this is a great advocacy organization, but because they're all biologically different, it's not like they have the means to be able to study them all scientifically. So how we all work together as nonprofit, that's a big question, and I think we should all make an effort to leverage each other's dollars so we can maybe impact some decision that the industry is making, so we can accelerate things that will benefit us all. Like, again, biomarker is one of them. Validating some wearables, this is another big topic, is another, right? So it's not about the disease, and it's really about what technology can we apply to those diseases and describe them accurately so industry can actually use those measures tangibly and not just
and I do think that that's a relevant and important conversation in the healthcare space anyways, because we are at the point, in my opinion, right now, where much more is in fact possible scientifically. We already talked about that. But what often is missing is the right collaboration. We're not going to do these innovations, the next big things that are already possible, often are impeded by the lack of collaboration, the forums that bring the right people together, that would actually advance the thinking to the next level, make new connections. I'm going to now say, let's do that. How about that? And I could certainly see that happening in the rare disease space as a really critical step towards moving a whole space to the next level in how it operates. You did say, and I just kind of have to go back to the science. I think when I spoke with you earlier, you did say, imagine if we could find a cure for PSP, that would create a pathway for cure for several other rare diseases. And I'm assuming that's going back to the scientific conversation, right? In that there's a connection on the scientific level that can be made between certain rare diseases where that research really does help.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, there's if you think, we call it neurodegeneration, right? So if you think brain diseases, I bucket them in three types. There's trauma related, right?
Yeah.
Or it could be also vascular / trauma related. Could be neuropsychiatric, right? So autism or bipolar disorder, and then it's neurodegeneration where you start to lose brain cells, whether it's central nervous system or peripherally. The point is that in a neurodegeneration space, as I mentioned, it's also sometimes called proteinopathies, so diseases of protein that start to degrade. So if a cell has a regular quality control mechanism that, once it's find a protein that is truncated or has mutation, it takes it, degrades it. And then the thing that degrades it molecularly, it does look like a little shredder, and the protein goes through it and is degraded. So a lot of people now are trying to do, how can we hijack or enhance or take advantage of this quality control system and target those proteins that we know are pathological and that somehow the cell doesn't recognize? And how can we target those proteins to this quality control system? And if you could do that, and then companies are doing that, right? So if you could do that, you could address Alzheimer, you could address PSP, you could address Huntington, you could address MSA, Parkinson. And I'm not saying that as it sounds too good to be true, and it will be very difficult because the protein you try to target to this quality control system will be different. But the platform, and this is the key word of a lot of people now, if you think of Moderna, they have a platform to develop vaccines. You have a lot of people that have platform to develop a technology that is applicable to many different diseases. So absolutely, you could address more than one disease at the same time. The advantage, which it's hard to say that because it's a very difficult disease that progresses fast, but Alzheimer progresses really, really slowly, right? You could be for 20 years with very mild cognitive decline every year. So if you're trying to test efficacy of a treatment that targets a protein that is hypothesized to accumulate and therefore lead to cognitive decline, if you test this technique in an Alzheimer trial, you cannot do a trial for 10 years, right? A clinical trial, you have to do it for 12 months, 18 months, sometime 24 months. Maybe in Alzheimer, it won't be enough of a signal statistically for someone to go to the FDA and say, hey, our technique is working, we need to deploy it. If you do it in PSP and it works, you should see it because a PSP patient within 2 years progresses really quickly and the symptoms accumulate really fast. So you should be able to see an effect, and if there's efficacy, you should be able to see it in PSP, and it could be the same strategy to then deploy in Alzheimer. And I mentioned to you that Novartis has the same strategy. They have a particular, it's a public domain. If you go on clinicaltrial.gov and you look at their anti-tau trial, they have both a PSP and an Alzheimer population, and they started with PSP first. So my soapbox is to talk to them, and I talked to them 2 weeks ago, and I'll talk to them again in January, is to not give up PSP. Because from a pure business point of view, and this is a bold statement there, like from a pure business point of view, once they have enough proof that the patients are tolerating it well, that maybe it works a little bit, they could just say, okay, we put PSP on the side, we'll have an entire communication campaign around why we stop, and we go towards a much bigger market, because that's where real money is. They might do that because it's really tricky to deal with PSP patients. It's hard. You have to take care of the caregiver. They're a higher risk population. They're harder to find. The diagnosis mistakes are higher. So if you think of your equation there, going back to my business model, you'd be like, okay, we have a proof of concept. but now we have to stop because there's too much risk, but there are way more benefit into AD. So I've actually, one of the lead there, I said to them, and I know what I say just is worth just the words that I'm sharing with it. But I'm like, stick to it, because if it works, it's worth for our population. So I'm bringing up a lot of issue there, but yes, it could definitely bring a proof of concept for other diseases, and then therefore you could cure more than one. But there's also still the risk to benefit calculation.
That's the business. That's the financial
Yeah.
business risk benefit, not the.
Yeah.
And yet, so if we look at it, do you have a dollar figure as to what does it cost for the healthcare system or the society when we are not finding cures for diseases like PSP?
I knew you would ask me a question that I don't have an answer for, but it's a brilliant question, because I'm sure AbbVie and Biogen, for instance, they had a clinical trial going on for PSP and quite advanced trial. I'm sure they've done this burden to the healthcare system.
Yeah.
I should know that, but I don't. It's an interest because it's interesting to think about it, because it is a rare disease, right? But the cost of undiagnosed diseases, I'm sure it's exponential.
Yes.
Because another thing that I didn't mention with PSP is a lot of people have unexplained falls, either because they cannot really see well where they step because their eye movement start to become deregulated, so they trip into things, but also the system that control gaits start to fault and they fall. So they end up in the emergency care quite a lot. And if they don't know they have PSP, they will not know how to explain it. So if you think of the cost of undiagnosed disease, must be, I don't know if it's multiplied by X, but so it's I will have an answer for you in 6 months, I promise.
All right, you're coming back in 6 months. I'm going to switch. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit over here, and I'm going to talk a little bit more on a personal level. You took on a leadership position in a not-for-profit organization, and you are very close to the patients. What has been the most impactful learning so far for you? I think you started there in 2020, and
correct.
And the last year or so, you have been actually in your current position as the executive director.
Yep.
Most impactful moment.
I mean, I guess I never have just one. I'll mention the board at Cure PSP. The majority of board members have been affected by the disease, so they've lost someone to it, and they were the caregiver of the person. So if you think of, those are my 12 or 14 bosses, right? People that I report to and talk to and collaborate with frequently. Being driven by this reality. I guess the most impactful is a regret I have is like people have to be affected by something to care about something. Just if you think about it, we have to have gone through something to say, oh, I lost, my wife or my husband to this disease and I want to do something. Of course, I'm very happy that those people react. I'm not saying something negative about this popular group. I'm saying something a little bit critical about the other side. It's like we tend to not care if we have not been affected. And for me, what's impactful, people ask me, say, oh, were you affected by the disease? Why is it that you're so enthusiastic? Why is it that you're all in this organization? Did you lose someone to the disease? Absolutely not. I've been lucky that my dad is 85 and healthy, and everybody around me is healthy. But this is the most impactful, is that I found a small organization that touches all the aspect of what it takes to develop a cure or help people or raise awareness. So it's a lofty goal all across, but I have I'm just in contact directly with reality of those that need us, and I know of all the unmet need also on the thing that have always fascinated me, which is innovation and how do you advance, new discovery to the market, right? So it's all happening at the same time, and so I'm not answering your question here, but the most impactful is to be in a position that has no silo. There's no silos in what I do. Like within one day, I will talk to all these different stakeholders and I will do something that touches on all aspects of the mission that I shared with you. And so that to me the most impactful. And of course, you cannot scale this. If you are the CSO of Novartis, you cannot do everything. But I wish that people that are a little bit all the way up to much, much larger organization could be in a real way in contact with all the different stakeholders that are affected by the decision that they're making. And yeah, so I guess that would be the most impactful, is that I am in contact with all the variable of this really complex equation on a daily basis.
And the true patient. So I think with that thought, to take that sort of a little bit further, you're doing patient advocacy, your organization does patient advocacy. Unless you happen to be a physician, many people in the healthcare system don't necessarily, or at least in the innovation side of that system, in the life sciences, they don't actually meet real patients that often.
Exactly.
And that's kind of what you're alluding to here. That patient, meeting a patient in this space, and going there with that patient experience. How do you bring that to those who have not been through that, who have not seen it? You're an advocacy organization. How can we bring that forward in that awareness side? You know, when you're really building awareness beyond the immediate group of those who have already been affected. How can we do that better?
Yeah, again, in my capacity, right, with the limited amount of people we have, I give you a couple examples. I was working with this company on the West Coast, and they do really early science. It's not a CRO, it's a biotech company that develop different proof of concept for like basic science. And once a year, they have a retreat, and all the scientists, like molecular biologists, cell biologists, neuroscientists, chemists, they're all, like the real, talk about people that just think of what they're trying to solve because it's so complex, and I understand why. I had, I reached out to them, and in a conversation that was not really first with the objective of what happened, I said to them, I have some really, really well-organized, intelligent, excited advocate, caregiver, and patients that would be more than happy to talk to your scientist. And then it became like a, why? Because it's not that they were interested by PSP. It's not that they had a program. It's not that they had even a program so focused on PSP, but it's to bring the reality of a patient experience to all those early scientists. And then this duo, as I call them, caregiver patient, we got them a little bit of public speaking training, and they worked on a little bit of a speech, and then they talked and presented it in front of 300, nerds, scientists, that just never left their nose from their benches. And I'm not criticizing it, as like it's needed, because what they're trying to solve is complex. And they talked to them for a couple hours, and then they open up for Q&A. I don't have a metric on how that was impactful, right? But that's an example. Another example is that I was at UMass Boston, and it was not a hospital, right? We never met patients. We just thought of science. UMass Worcester, it's a medical institute, maybe there are patients. But I talked to a couple of PhD that came from places where it was a medical research institute, and they said, what I miss is that I cannot introduce patients to my postdocs and my PhD. So I make it happen. Mm-hmm. I find a patient that lives within 10 miles of this person because, transport is complicated. And I organize a meeting like this, right? So that's not scalable, right? But at the same time, I do it even if there's not like a clear objective of like, we are pharma X, we're thinking of going into disease Y, we want to do a focus group with patients that have disease Y. It's not just when I do that. I do that just so more people are in direct contact with patients, because when they are, in this space, patients are their self-advocate. If they go to a doctor, the doctor will not know about the disease. And I have some story to share about that. And we have a pager that is defined for healthcare professional. And the patient says, before you do anything with me, read this.
Yes.
So that also is the way. So empowering patients to be their own advocate, and getting on their soapboxes, and then really explaining to people what they have, so they will be at least taken care of in a way that will not create more complication to what they have.
I love that. I love this idea of empowering patients to be their own advocate, and giving that support that is needed, as well as the connections for that to happen. From a challenge perspective, if you were to look back now in the last year particularly, as a leader, biggest challenge leading a not-for-profit in this space?
Bandwidth.
Bandwidth?
No, I mean, no, I mean, if you think as a leader, there's so many. We have a lot of opportunity coming to our door. I guess the
Yeah.
biggest challenge is to really to have to when I have to say no to something. Honestly, because there's it's always been a tough no to say. You know, some no's are easy because like it's not part of our strategy, it's not part of our priority, it's not in our budget, right? But because of our community being so intimately connected to the experience, you know, it's the ideas, the suggestion, people wanting to volunteer. If we're limited with our staff and our bandwidth, we have to sometimes deprioritize certain things. And I think as a leader, this is the toughest, right? Because you know you're leaving people behind. I'll give you an example. We offer a grant to help families pay for in-home care, right? We call it the respite caregiver respite program. So there's no caregiver burnout. At least we try to minimize that because it's 24-hour care, right? So we have a grant, and then we have just a staff of 2 that is administrating the grant, and we have a fixed budget. And the better we are advertising for it, the more application we have. And then my team is asking me to increase the budget for this. And at this point, I can in this year, right? So I have to say no to that, meaning I have to say no to helping more people that are in need, right? So as a leader, that's tough.
Yeah. How do you work with that yourself? I mean, how emotionally? I'm getting very personal here, but
Yeah,
but I know that you have a big heart and you care truly. That's evident in this, and obviously you have an organization that's all about that. So emotionally, how are you able to sort of work through that yourself? The fact that there is such a thing as having to say no. There is such a thing that
I think,
we can't do it
yeah, I
all.
think,
Right.
future will tell in our growth, I hope. Emotionally, I turn into being more motivated to fundraise towards it, so we can do more. I mean,
Yeah.
I think and I'm saying that if anybody from my organization listens to it, and I hope they will, they'll know that we haven't grown it too much. We have grown it by a few patients per quarter, right? But we have to be able to fundraise towards it. So I think that that emotion that I feel and the difficulty that I have in having to say no to this or to a great scientific idea that I wish we could fund, but we can't because we're limited, turns into more efficient kind of describing case for support and be more genuine when I'm trying to reach out to someone that I know could open their generosity a bit more, right? So again, we're a small organization, so and the board is involved in fundraising, and hopefully soon we'll hire someone dedicated to that. But the point is, this is how I probably alleviate a little bit of the emotional burden of all of that, right? And then when I talk to patients, there's always some joy and some good times, right? So that balances it, right? And I'm telling you, you're talking to people that are in a very tough spot, but they have the right energy, and they always like to interact with us directly because they're amazed that they can talk to the leader of the organization and someone who's also a scientist and who also talks to the other side, right, to drug development. I mean, that's an interesting thing. In big organization, a patient advocate might just be always with patient, and so they're less of a integrator as you described me being, right? So now I'm integrating all this information and I can communicate to them, and it makes me feel better. But I turn this into hopefully being more efficient and increasing our resources so we can do more. And it's never ending, but at least we can do better.
The work of the leader is partly making the trade-offs and keeping not just yourself but the organization focused, and that's not an easy thing to do. So from that perspective, I guess I have 2 last questions as we need to wrap up today. And first one, perhaps on the personal side first. What one thing, if there is one thing that you think is the guiding factor that defines your own leadership agenda as you think about your work?
The every time I think of this, it evolves. But to go back to something you mentioned, me being a scientist, right? Having such an opportunity to learn, right? When you learn to get to somewhere, it's a different efficiency, right? I got here and I have a lot to learn that is the additional part of my brain that is not the scientist, like the executive, the strategist, uh, building all the relationship and the politics around it, right? So I'm in this driver's seat, and I have a lot of opportunity to learn while pursuing those new avenues. And to me, if as a leader, regardless of the size of the organization, if you could find that, if you could have that, to me that drives me, right? So if I was in a seat that I felt that I know all the recipe and all the secrets and I just need to apply them to a new problem, to me that would be extremely, I was going to say boring, and that's the wrong word, but it would be counterproductive. I have so much to learn and to do better because I come from the science background, right? And it is a small nonprofit. So I would say that's the one thing that matters the most to me is that I know I'll be good and quick at learning them, and I'm looking forward every time to meet that new thing I need to really quickly acquire and deploy on the field. It's not theoretical, like it's happening now. So
it's
I don't know if that answers your question,
learning and application combined. Then
yeah.
yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
and because I think because of the size of the organization and how we're supported, we bring value. If we do something, if we do it better, then this is where the space for learning happens, right? Because we could
Better is
really,
good. Better is good, and I think this is what needs to always be in mind for many of us. It would be great to change the world all at once,
just,
but
yeah.
incremental is also sometimes quite much better, and better is good, right?
I would argue that this is how stuff really happens. A lot of wonderful organizations have, I'd mentioned the vision versus our mission, right? Our vision is quite
Yeah.
out there. The mission is quite pragmatic. And it's important to have the two. If you just have this, if what you're trying to achieve is you feel that you will do it, but it's always going to be in 20 years, then you're always chasing your tail, right? So it's like if you have to help people now or in 5 years, and then it's never ideal. I mentioned the ALS treatment; it increases lifespan by 25%. It's a big conversation, and the medicine is costly, but it's better, right?
And
Patients.
It's achievable,
Yeah.
it's real, absolutely. Okay, so then the second question and last question for the day, and that is that one piece of advice. We've talked a lot about changing patient outcomes, and I want to end with that thought. Your organization, your work is all about changing patient outcome, but there are many others out there who are also today focusing on patient outcomes and wondering how we do that best. Is there a piece of advice you would give to someone else today?
Yeah, when I think about this, is like I think we always bring the patients too late in the equation, and a lot of people always talk about how we need to bring them earlier, and it's not easy to bring them earlier. I've had project where we brought patient for developing a clinical trial protocol really early on, and it opened a Pandora box because they had all sorts of questions. But this is if you really want to address questions in the process, or whether it's regulatory or clinical development, and you really want to understand how it's going to eventually be efficient from a patient perspective, you have to bring the patient earlier on. So it's not an advice to, maybe it's not an advice in leadership, but it's an advice in strategy for those foundations. Is to really work hard to build structure, to bring the patient voice earlier on in a formal way. And I'm just starting doing that, right? As I saying that to you, I realize that I still have to do a lot of work to do that, right? But this is a problem I hope I have in 2 years, that there's 3 or 4 pharma companies that have promising therapeutics, and then they need access to patients. And now you have to have this issue of competing for patients. And we cannot have that either, right? So can we build structure that organize patients in a way that, we have particular clinical trial platforms or all the things that others can utilize? So bringing patients in the actual, as a real stakeholder, and not just as a check mark, that we've gotten patient feedback from it. So that's more of a call to action than an advice to a leader, but it's a good way to end this wonderful interview.
I absolutely love that call to action. And I put it out there for the for-profit side as well as the not-for-profit side, as well as the physicians, because I think changing mindset about patient outcomes is a work of all of us. Kristophe, thank you so much for this time with you, and best of luck on your journey and for Cure PSP. I love what you do, and let's make sure that you come back in 6 months with some of those answers that you promised.
All right, 6 months, that sounds good. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Tarja.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Check out leadersagenda.com for information on our past and future episodes. And I do hope that you engage with us also on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook, and post your comments about what you heard today and your ideas forward. Kiitos. Thank you.